Dear ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ákos Lukács. I would like to introduce you to our today's session, which session of the Financing the Energy Transition in Hungary conference is related to the ESG-related risks, their measurement, and data requirements in Hungary. Welcome, everyone. And let me give you a short timeline of today's conference. In this session, we will have 3 keynote speeches, and then we will have a panel discussion and questions and remarks. I would like to introduce our first speaker as a keynote speaker, Barnabás Ács, who is Global Head of Sales Strategy, Sustainable Finance and Investing at London Stock Exchange Group. He will be followed by Rita Szalai, who is General Manager of ESG Capital Solutions. And then we will have Will Mason, Lead Associate for Sustainable Finance at the Financial Conduct Authority. Barnabás, if you have a presentation, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ákos. Let me just share my screen quickly. And can you please confirm that you can see that?
Yes. Yes, we see.
Something is not good. Now, is it better?
It looks good.
It looks good. All right, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Dear all, I was tasked to talk about ESG-related risks and their measurement, and of course the challenges about them. And I set myself a 15-minute kind of timeline for it, so I will try to go through as meaningfully as possible. But first, let's start with space. I'm sure you know that Felix Baumgartner has jumped from the edge of space, and I'm sure you know Richard Branson has been in space, and I'm sure you know that also Jeff Bezos has been in space, because the comments and tweets were somewhat different. Although I'm not so certain you know that also Captain Kirk was in space. The oldest man in space, William Shatner, was there a few months after Jeff Bezos went to space. And his remarks and memoirs around that are really fascinating. And this is why I've been starting with a black screen, because what he said was, and of course these are snippets from his book and the interview with him. When I looked into space, there was no mystery, no majestic ave to behold. All I saw was death. I saw a cold, dark, black emptiness. It was unlike any blackness you can see or feel on Earth. And then I looked towards Earth. And then he goes on and says, I could see the curvature of Earth, the beige of the desert, the white of the clouds, and the blue of the sky. It was life, nurturing, sustaining life, Mother Earth. Every day, we are confronted with the knowledge of further destruction of Earth at our hands, the extinction of animal species, of flora and fauna, things that took 5 billion years to evolve. So I thought that, I show you Mother Earth, Gaia, who we have to save, and which is giving us this sustained life, and that this is why I really much like what William Shatner or Captain Kirk was saying, because it includes, during 5 billion years, the whole longevity, which we have to nurture and save and perceive and keep for the rest of the generations that come. So just a couple of things in metrics. You see the top left corner showing the increasing of average temperatures around the globe. You also see that in the last 50 years, while humanity has doubled in size, basically vertebrate animal population has lost 70% of its population. And you also see in the left bottom corner the CO2 emissions since 1955, the energy consumption since 1955. And you also see how much these were increasing, and although good news, decoupling, it's very, very warning sign that with the increasing energy consumption that we are looking ahead to, we really need to improve the CO2 intensity of energy use. So that's in front of us. That's what we have to solve for primarily. And when we talk about sustained life, it's very important that there are three letters that we are trying to describe this. Obviously, I made it a little bit smaller circle than Earth itself because it doesn't cover really the entirety of sustainability. As somebody would say, ESG is not like a Bauhaus building, it's like a Baroque church. And to that we stand. ESG covers the environmental, social, and governance angles of how sustainability is described. And there are a couple of areas that are really facing high priority. And this is in the E section, the transition risk, then the physical risk, which is basically aiming heavily at the global warming feature that we have. We have the biodiversity risk that multiple times comes up because of the animal population decrease, because of the crop diversification drop, and of course, because of the voluntary carbon markets, where we also have to sort of take into consideration biodiversity as well. And circularity. Circularity risks are very important and increasingly important because I don't know whether you know, but for industries, steel, aluminium, cement, and plastic basically account 25% of global CO2 emissions. So if we could cut that, we would be way better forward in the whole cause. We have the internal social risks that are related about the company's adaptation capabilities when it comes to its workforce, its talent. We have the external social risks, the company's footprint and shadow on the global environment and to the societal changes. And as it's very important, I took it out, the human rights risk. When it comes to the G, we tend to forget that, of course, implementation and impact are key parts of the governance angles. You know, when you basically put out a strategic initiative and then you don't develop up on it, or if you issue a green bond and you just don't put up the wind farm that's described there, or if you apply child labor, that's reputational angles of risk, and the increasing amount of regulations are also huge amount of burden that is going to be landed on companies. Now, some of you who are maybe not that sentimental as that Earth picture was at the beginning would say, all right, why does it relate to my financial risk? How does it impact my market and credit risk, liquidity risk, operational risk? They should be intact. I have bad news because through the transmission channels that are serviced by the households, by the businesses, and by macro factors, these data risks, these risks from ESG risk to quickly turn into financial risk. And along that way, when we try to analyze them, we are facing there are serious risk around data, ESG data, and models that are trying to describe them and put them into the traditional way of financial thinking. So let's just see an example. The two most important ones that we call out nowadays is physical risk and transition risk. So when we talk about physical risk, then we of course talk about two things, the chronic and the acute. The chronic is the more global temperature, participation, agricultural productivity, sea level rises. The acute ones are the sort of the immediate weather patterns that we experience day in, day out, heat waves, floods, cyclones, wildfires. When it comes to transition risk, it's of course the mitigation risk and revenue exposure to our companies, the technology development and the consumer preferences that we have to cater for and really adjust for. Mitigation risk being one of the biggest ones because that's what the CO2 footprint entails. And now here are the transmission mechanisms, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but you have to see that in business, there is the property damage, the business disruption from severe weather. There are increasingly legal liabilities. There are changing demands and costs. Of course, we know about the different generations, millennials, etc., etc. For the households, we see the loss of income from weather, the property damage again from weather, and in global trends, we see the shift in prices, the productivity and labor markets that is affected by the weather, etc., etc. And when it comes to market risk, then of course this will become repricing of commodities, estates, real estates, loan, fixed income, equities, basically all asset classes. It will affect credit risks to default by businesses and households, and the collateral depreciation, which is huge, especially when it comes to physical risk, the liquidity risk, the refinancing risk, increased insurance gap, etc., etc. In operational risks, we have to highlight the supply chain disruption and forced facility closure. Now, okay, we understand that what are the physical risks now, what are the transition risks, and how do they transform into the key financial risk, market, credit, liquidity, and operational risk. But when it comes to data and models, it's actually getting even more complicated. So when we look at physical risks and transition risk, we look at data such as historic and forecasted weather data, and models for chronic changes in estimations. And of course, weather forecast models are going to be key on actually not just capturing the data, but trying to make some meaning of it. When it comes to the transition risk, CO2 emissions are key. And of course, if you have started to do or deal with such things, you will see the CO2 calculation methodologies differ, and there are at least 3 or 4 of them. And then you didn't calculate scope 3 just yet. Scope 3 is basically the value chains CO2 emission to the atmosphere, and it heavily involves the supply chain knowledge of your businesses and how and what exposure they do carry. And when it comes to transition risk, of course, we have to mention the sort of net zero aspect and the manifestation of them, the carbon capture and storage and the direct air capture solutions, which of course we have to have proper impact measurement and estimations, and we all know what scandalous openings we can see when it comes to retirement of different CO2 quota. When it comes to the transmission angle, there is, of course, huge amount of data that are required. Company real estate, location informations, real estate and location resilience, i.e. it also plays a role, what kind of buildings and what type of defense mechanisms I have around them, supply chain member information and location, commodity facility production information, labor market structure and available professional knowledge and talent, national and regional macro data, project capacities, costs, and financing data, which are increasingly important to know where what is built at what cost with what financing mechanisms, and of course, who is the big financer. And when it comes to the risk angles, then of course, models play heavily a role, integration into existing risk models, or even better, if there is any, new model builds as existing ones do not really apply. For example, the financial performance / impact included into overall performance measurement when it comes to share values. So when we talk about data and model, as you see, there is just the Pandora box. So it requires experts availability. There has to be debated and of course discussed whether you need disclosure or estimation is enough, coverage, onboarding, audibility, materiality, double materiality, timeliness, frequency, private and public company data, first mover advantage or should I wait, transparency and IP when I do analytics and I sell on them, or when I do ESG ratings, lack of standards and analytics, validation and redistribution. How do you make certain that the data that you are using is valid, is verified, is transparent enough, and is coming from the right sources? Do I cover all the asset classes that I need? So the challenges are just immense, and I think the panel that we are is going to go through that quite in detail. I want to leave you with 3 thoughts towards the end. A number, 40 minutes. This is the energy in sunlight striking the earth, which is the equivalent of the whole global energy consumption for a year. Yes. Is it always and for all countries the same? Is it for all nations the same? No. But would it be providing an opportunity to actually switching from digging mud and then accelerate ourselves to the next century? Yes. Another one, which is basically this sort of looks like the good, the bad, and the ugly, just to refer to Clint Eastwood as well. This is a very important graph which shows 2 things. One, scope 3 emissions are basically just unimaginably big compared to the scope 1 and 2 that we tend to know nowadays about our company. This is, by the way, oil major companies' scope 3 emissions, so it's not always this high, but you have to bear that in mind that it's multitudes and multiples of the scope 1 and 2s that you tend to know about your company. So prep for that. The other one, when we talk about carbon trucks or carbon cost, I just brought you an example. This is again a oil major company. In the references, you can find its name. What it shows is that to 45 billion of revenue, currently with no cost of CO2, their net income is $8.1 billion. It quickly falls to 7.3 billion if you take scope 1 and 2 into consideration as a cost of $40 were the carbon cost that they internally price their projects at. And basically what we did was with our modeling that we put it into the P&L account, a line item to the cost angles, the cost of carbon, if you had to pay all that amount for this to remove from air or as a tax. If the whole value chain scope 3 emission is taken into consideration with $40, you immediately turn a loss-making company, a loss of $1.6 billion. And if you use the current price of carbon, which is trading at around $75 a ton, then you are immediately looking 10 billion in losses in the same year as you made 8.1 billion. So just the thought process from fiduciary duties to sentiment, etc., you are a believer or not, it will not play this way, but the transition risk is just in front of, is very, very well represented with this graph. And just, is there anywhere to hide? My answer is really no. In the word art that took me like 3 hours to compile, you see actually just 32 regulations that I have highlighted, from CSRD to SFDR to SRD2, the taxonomy regimes, etc. You have to know that currently we do have around 2,966 climate change laws and policies around the globe, around 500 more than we had 2 or 3 years ago. However, what's also very important telling is that climate litigation cases have risen from 435 in 2019 to 2,169 in 2022. So with RAG and with actual legal cases on the back of them, it is going to be ever more important and difficult to escape sustainability and transition as a key takeaway from the world that we are living in. With that, I thank you for your attention. Looking forward to discussing this more with you in detail. And of course, as per the appropriate references, please refer to this slide. Ákos, I give it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Barney. It was really great to see, starting from Earth up until the regulations and the legislations we have on Earth, to be sure that we are properly reporting and measuring ESG risks. So by that, we keep you for the panel as well, and thank you very much for that. I will hand over the floor to Rita and look at some of the reporting practices in Hungary. Rita, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, as Ákos mentioned, my topic is the ESG reporting practice in Hungary, and I would like to start with a quick snapshot of the Hungarian market. I come from a capital market background. I used to work for 16 years for the Budapest Stock Exchange, so my view is more of like an investment point of view. What we can see on the market is that there are not too many sustainable investment products. So actually, a friend of mine just asked me a few days ago. He said that he wanted to buy some green product, and he looked over the market and he couldn't find anything. And unfortunately, that is the case that there are not too many products. The volumes are low, and proportion of sustainable products to like all the product offerings is relatively low, and the offering range is also a bit narrow. So we can see even on the stock exchange, mostly there are some equity companies like Alteo, mostly the companies which are in some way in the green energy sector. They are the maybe the most active ones. So you can buy some equities on the stock exchange, and also some private investments are available, or M&A opportunities in like solar panel manufacturers or service companies, but not too many. We have some green bonds, which the stock exchange has a new MTF market segment. It is called BSEX bond, and there are around like 15 specifically green bonds. There was like a growth program which ended last year. So within that growth program, these bonds were listed, and there was some state subsidy available for the issuance. So it was very popular, of course. I think there are two ETFs, UBS ETFs on the stock exchange's other MTF market, which is called Beta. What you can also see is that the investment funds are not very active, so there are not too many investment notes available, which are sustainable. As for the investors, we dominantly see institutional investors, so retail investors are not very much interested. To turn to our focus point today, if you see the ESG transparency levels of the Hungarian companies, we can also see that the reporting level is relatively low. Even among the stock exchange listed companies, ESG reporting is perhaps limited to the blue chip companies and maybe the ones in the energy sector. Not too many companies are issuing reports. However, it is changing. We'll see by the end of the presentation that there is some shift, thankfully. And I think that ESG ratings, they are even more rare than ESG reporting. What we can see is now that, of course, there is the NFRD reporting and some voluntary reporting companies, but perhaps like 1/5 of the stock exchange listed companies. So all in all, we can say that there is room to improve that level. What we can see is that we can look behind the reasons. We look for reasons why this is happening on the Hungarian market, and I think that the ESG drivers are pretty much the same in Hungary as they are globally. So of course there is an overarching regulatory framework, international treaties, EU regulations, which puts pressure on market participants in Hungary as well as in the EU, and I think all over the world. But also, I think there are increasing market forces which are pressurizing the companies, which come from investors, financial intermediaries, banks, creditors, and also consumers. And we can see that this pressure is increasing as the environmental and social awareness is increasing among those participants. Now, if we take these one by one, I guess starting maybe with the consumers, I think that the consumer awareness in Hungary is perhaps not as high as internationally. But of course, we can see now that it is becoming more and more important for people to buy products that are sustainable. But it's not really a leading phenomenon, I guess, in Hungary. Financial intermediaries, on the other hand, especially banks, are very active. This is mostly due to the intervention of the central bank, that there are some state subsidized loans available for both companies and the retail. So I think that this pressure from the banks, that they would like to place green loans, is increasing, and this can be felt by the companies already. And also we have increased awareness among investors, but this is also not at the levels of the international investor communities. What we can also see is that inquiries, questionnaires, due diligence inquiries are coming from supply chains. So companies, Hungarian companies who work with multinational companies can already feel the pressure, and I think this is probably the same as in all other European countries. So if a company, even if it's an SME company, but it works for like Samsung or for BMW or Audi, then they will pretty soon face difficulties providing these companies with good quality data. What we can see on the Hungarian market is pretty strange, because if we ask investors, they say that they are waiting for some sustainable products to be created on the market and to become available. But on the other hand, if we try to speak with investment funds and ask them why there are no products on the market, they say that there are not enough investors on the Hungarian market. So they kind of wait for each other, and it's not really, there's no meeting point. And I think it's also a Hungarian specialty, or a special feature, that usually all the market participants are waiting for some sort of help, some intervention from the state. So I mean, state subsidies, supported loans, products, supported learning opportunities, something from the central banks, something from the stock exchange. As for the regulatory background, I don't think that I need to explain much of what is happening, because it's the same all over Europe, and I think globally the same principles are behind regulations. In Europe, we have these three very important regulations. Of course, the CSRD, which is supposed to boost the corporate reporting practices, the taxonomy, which gives the basic definition of what is sustainable and what is not, and the SFDR, which puts pressure on the financial market participants and obliges them to make their own reportings. And the big problem with this is, at least in Hungary, but I think probably not only in Hungary, is that the whole data flow should come, or should go from the left to the right. So first of all, the large companies and the companies which have relatively big impact should provide good quality data to the market participants, to the end users, to the investors, to the FMPs, and then the FMPs would be able to create their products and to report on the sustainability content of their products. But the problem is that they have to do this reporting sooner than they have these data from the companies. So there is a huge data gap on the Hungarian market. And this data gap is it was realized. I mean, it's not recent. Probably with the stock exchange, we saw that like 3 years ago that this was going to be a problem. The Hungarian central bank saw this, and these institutions are trying to help the market participants in any way they can. For instance, the Hungarian Central Bank has a green program, and it also has recommendations. Mostly it impacts the banking sector, of course, and it made possible that there would be supported green loans available, which have preferential capital requirements, so they can be offered with better conditions. But this is mostly in the area of banking and loans. On the capital market, on the other hand, it's mostly the Budapest Stock Exchange who is trying to take the lead. Actually, the Budapest Stock Exchange is the sort of caretaker of the corporate governance code, which tries to give guidance and some sort of best practice for Hungarian listed issuers, and it deals with many issues which are ESG related. For instance, the women on board rates and a lot of corporate governance practices which go beyond the regulatory minimum. But it is mostly for listed companies, and even among listed companies, it's mostly for listed equity companies. There also about 2 years ago, the stock exchange realized that this was going to be a problem, that there's not enough data on the Hungarian market, and launched a market consultation regarding the ESG reporting practices, and was trying to figure out what is the biggest problem on the market, and it was mostly the lack of information and knowledge on the company's side. So the stock exchange decided to put together and issue an ESG reporting guide for these companies, but it was not meant only for the Hungarian or for the listed companies, but for basically the entire market. And I guess we worked together with Ákos there. I was the lead consultant and co-writer of this guide, and Ákos and his team was also on it. I think it was a great experiment, and I think that the market still uses that guide very much. So we can see that there's a lot of inquiry. There are a lot of inquiries about that. Companies are really a bit more knowledgeable about ESG things and the reporting flow and the needs. So I guess this was a very good beginning. But the stock exchange wanted to give more to the market, and still, within the area of education. The stock exchange wants to create some sort of center of excellence around itself, where it makes available programs for investors and companies as well. For instance, there are 2 programs ongoing now: a subsidized ESG learning program, which is available for SME companies, and also a subsidized advisory program for SMEs, which helps them create their own reporting practices. And a completely new challenge and program is now also with the participation of Ákos's team, is to create an issue a transparency rating method. It's not a risk rating method. I would like to emphasize that, but something to give to the companies which can measure their ESG transparency levels. And a methodology is now being developed, and also a web portal which will include this data and makes it available for interested parties. And the stock exchange hopes, and this is also state subsidized, and the stock exchange hopes that this will give some boost to to the data issuance of Hungarian companies, and also will improve the data quality of the ESG data on the Hungarian market. We see that there is a long way to go, but I think that these initiatives will help a lot, and maybe that this huge gap will be more or narrower, a lot narrower in like 1 or 2 years. And of course, when like all the CSRD enters into force, then that will also add another level and will increase that awareness and that quality and capacity on the Hungarian market. So basically, this is what I wanted to say. Thank you very much for the attention. I give it back to Ákos.
Thank you, Rita, and thank you for your insight on the Hungarian capital market and the developments on ESG for all the market participants. I think despite the fact that investors don't find their pursuits on the market, there is a very intensive regulatory support so that they can do so in the future. And I think by that, I would like to invite Gwil to be the next presenter. Gwil, very nice to have you here. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, looking forward to this. Really, really happy to be here today on this event around financing the energy transition. I think I'm going to talk a little bit about a tool that can be used to monitor and evaluate the energy transition, which is, of course, ESG data and ratings. I'm going to talk about what they are, what they can be used for, and I'll also talk about, as has been mentioned, why regulators are increasingly interested in ESG data and ratings, why the FCA is, and what we're planning to do in this area. So first things first, what are ESG data and ratings? So I think the first thing to say is that this is still very much an emerging space. So nothing is really fixed yet in terms of definitions here. However, we can probably separate out the ESG data and the ESG ratings and consider them in turn. So when we think of ESG data, that is just data relating to environmental, social, or governance factors. So the amount of CO2 emitted by a company over a period of time, that could be captured in an ESG data set. And then if you look at ESG ratings, you've got an additional component there. So it's not just raw data. These ESG ratings, they're products that have an additional element of judgment there. So many present themselves as like an assessment of the sustainability of a rated entity. So what does that look like in practice? Well, if we look at Sustainalytics, which is one of the biggest ESG data and ratings providers in the market, it rates companies. So it rates, for example, Tesla 28.7, which doesn't mean very much by itself, but it helpfully says that that is a medium risk. So that's its assessment of Tesla. So you can see there the distinction. That isn't just data. There's some kind of judgment there. There's some kind of opinion there. And before I talk about what people can use with those judgments and opinions, let me just flag that this is something that came up in the regulatory context, but ESG ratings are not the same thing as credit ratings. So the language is quite similar. Both of them use scores in their assessment. So, AAA, or you have numbers maybe. Some credit ratings agencies have started producing ESG ratings as well, but that's really where the similarities end between the two, because ultimately ESG ratings are assessing the sustainability attributes of a rated entity, but credit ratings are focusing solely on the creditworthiness of a rated entity. So even if ESG factors are incorporated into that, that will still only be in the context of creditworthiness and the risk of default. So really, they are completely different things, leaving aside the nascent market for ESG ratings and other factors. Now, I said that we could separate out ESG data and ESG ratings, which is broadly true, but did also flag it's still an evolving market. So the line between ESG data and ESG ratings can be a little bit blurry. So you could have some kind of product that uses ESG data, but then it has some kind of additional value add there bolted on, but it doesn't give like a score, for example. So what is that? Is that data or is that a rating? So these are the kind of issues that we're grappling with as the regulator, and these are really the kind of issues that the market is also still working through. But at the moment, we can consider them together. So what are these things ESG data and ratings used for? Well, I guess the answer to that is an increasing number of things. So when the FCA first started looking at ESG data and ratings, which was last year, we spoke to lots of financial services firms about the use cases for these products, and those included using these products to structure sustainable investment products, for example, funds, or incorporating them into a benchmarks methodology to make some kind of sustainable benchmark which lists the sustainable companies in an index. But again, I keep mentioning this, the market's evolving very fast. So new providers are coming in. They've got a new proposition for the market, and firms are using all of the products in the market in new ways. So we've heard that insurers, for example, are starting to use ESG data when they're underwriting. And banks, we know, are considering them in the context of lending decisions as well. So really, these kind of things are being hardwired, or they're feeding through into lots of the financial system. And coming back to the theme of this event, investors are increasingly using these products to track how companies are aligning themselves to the energy transition. So, for example, one ESG rating that is out there in the market is implied temperature rise, which indicates the extent to which investee companies are aligned with climate targets. All right, so hopefully that gives a bit of an idea what these things are. So, and also I should say what they're being used for. So let me talk a little bit about why the FCA is interested, why the regulator's interested in this, and what we're doing. So I'll take the why first, and then I'll move on to the what. So our starting point here, as with quite a lot of our work around sustainable finance, is trust. We set out in our ESG strategy, which we published last November, that we want to build trust in ESG, sustainable labeled instruments, products, and the supporting ecosystem. So that includes supporting the integrity and effectiveness of ESG data and ratings. We know that ESG data and ratings are being increasingly incorporated into financial products, services, and infrastructure. I've just gone through a couple of the use cases and the new use cases that we're seeing there. And if you have that kind of situation, to maintain market integrity, market participants need to be able to trust those products that they're integrating into what they're doing. But we're concerned that that isn't always the case. We don't think that participants currently always trust ESG data and ratings. Why do we think that? Well, we released a consultation paper in 2021, which had a discussion chapter about ESG data and ratings. We identified some potential harms in the market. And respondents to that consultation came back and said, yes, we agree with the harms you've identified here. Yes, there is a lack of trust in this market. And then following that, we set out in a feedback statement earlier this year in the summer, what we want to see here. So what are the desired regulatory outcomes that we want? So what are those? Well, the first one of those is transparency. So it's enhanced transparency of ESG data and ratings products, and specifically the methodologies. And we think that transparency over methodologies is really important to help users interpret what they measure and how they do so. So, you know, as a user of these kind of things, if you're an investor, if you're a bank, if you're an insurer, if you're whatever, if you're not a part of the financial services ecosystem, if you're another stakeholder, you need to know, what is this product trying to do and how is it doing that? And some of the feedback we've heard is that isn't always the case. And then secondly, we flagged the importance of things like strong governance, the importance of managing conflicts of interest, and robust systems and controls to underpin data and ratings products. And that would give the market a bit of confidence that they're objective, that they're independent, that they're free from bias, and they're determined as a result of a systematic process, and they're of reliable quality. So that's what we're looking to achieve. Those are our desired regulatory outcomes. And given the potential for harm should those outcomes not be achieved, and the benefit to the wider market functioning in this, you know, effective way that we want to move towards, we signaled that we saw a clear rationale for introducing regulation to try and get us to that outcome. And we heard a lot of support from people responding to our consultation paper, people saying, yeah, I think that regulatory oversight in this space would be helpful. So that's where we are at the moment. I think just one small point to make on the regulation side of things. So as with a lot of our work in this area of sustainable finance, the FCA is very keen to make sure that the UK isn't just introducing rules with no regard to what other countries are doing in this space. So we want all of our interventions to be internationally consistent. That's our baseline. So we said in our strategy, we're committed as far as possible to implementing regulation that aligns with international frameworks and standards. That's really our starting point. So in the case of ESG data and ratings, that means aligning any regulation we introduce with IOSCO's recommendations in this area, as well as considering developments in other jurisdictions that are looking at ESG data and ratings, such as Japan and the EU. And ultimately, we want to support the development of international standards and avoid regulatory fragmentation. Okay, so we want to regulate in this space. We know what we're trying to work towards with that. So what are our next steps? What can we expect from the FCA here? So at the moment, ESG data and ratings providers lie outside the FCA's regulatory perimeter. So partly just because it's quite a new activity, that means we don't have the power to regulate firms providing that regulated activity, or that activity, because it's not regulated at the moment. We don't have the power to regulate those firms directly. So extending our perimeter, giving us those powers, is a matter for government. The government first signaled that it was thinking about this in their roadmap to sustainable investing, which was released last October. And we were very happy to see the announcement last week that the government will consult on whether to extend our perimeter, and we'll be working very closely with them on that consultation. So what happens if the government consults? Well, the government is going to consult. What happens if they decide to extend our regulatory perimeter? So if that happens, the government will need to legislate. Following that, the FCA has all of our own processes for introducing rules in a proportionate and appropriate way. That sounds great. All of that, unfortunately, also takes time. So it will take us time for the government to do all of those things and for the FCA to do all of those things. But we really want to raise standards now because we think there's a risk of harm, as I've mentioned, if those harms crystallize further. So that's why we're acting now to raise standards in the short term, as well as working with the government on the regulation. Last month, we announced that we'd appointed ICMA and IRSG as joint secretariat for an industry-led group, and that group will be developing a voluntary code of conduct for ESG data and ratings providers. So the code will raise standards in the short term in advance of the potential regulation. It'll be accessible to all shapes and sizes of providers. So the first meeting of the code was last week, which was very productive. And over the next 6 months, that group will develop the code. They'll then put it out for consultation and update it and publish it before the end of next year. And as with our regulation, the code will be internationally consistent. So the FCA wrote the terms of reference for that group, and we directed them to follow IOSCO's recommendations in this area when developing the code. And just to be clear, the code is not a replacement for regulation. So we expect the code to live on following the introduction of potential regulation as a way of raising standards for firms that could fall outside of scope. But we're very strongly supportive of introducing regulation as well. So just mindful of time and just to recap where we are in this space. ESG data and ratings providers are being used in more and more ways by financial services firms. The FCA is acting quickly to address the potential harms we've identified and stop those crystallizing. The code of conduct will raise standards in the short term, and we're working closely with government as it consults on giving the FCA the powers to regulate those firms directly. So I hope that was helpful to give the regulatory perspective on this, what we're thinking about in this space, our next steps, and I'll stop there and hand back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. It was very fascinating to see how much progress you are making from the point of the financial authority on the market. And I think by having that keynote with you, I would like to unveil our panel and also invite you to join and stay with us in the background. But I would like to call upon 3 colleagues, 3 distinguished guests who will be on the panel today. Irene Marta, who is Managing Director for the Business Council for Sustainable Development in Hungary and has a great insight on what companies are doing in Hungary, both national and internationals, pledging for net zero and looking at how they are transitioning. We have also here György Szege, who is Head of ESG Department at the Hungarian Bank Holding. Very welcome, György. It will be great to see how your transforming bank is looking at ESG. Very nice to have you here. And we have also Zoltán Török, who is Head of Research at Raiffeisen. And with Zoltán, we hope to see a bit into the linkage in between economic progress, the current situation, and where ESG is falling in terms of risk. And we also very welcome back Barnabás from the keynote to help us and look and watch out for the UK-based progresses that are there from the UK investor side. So very happy to have you here. I made a quick intros for you so we can save time and start the discussion. But before that, I just wanted to give some background, actually, what we are going to look at and discuss in this panel. As we all know, the international investors with global investment portfolios are more and more increasing the call for very high quality, transparent, and also reliable reporting by the companies, and mainly on the climate and other environmental type of risks within the ESG matters. Because as they become more and more material, the more risk might emerge that has to be factored into any decision made around those type of assets, shares, bonds. It was approximately a year ago in November 2021 when the IFRS Foundation trustees were announced to be created as a new standard setting board. And the ISSB was helped to meet this demand, which is the International Sustainable Standards Board. So ultimately, the goal of this new board is to deliver a very comprehensive baseline of how the sustainability-related disclosure will be provided to investors, in what form, in what type of sustainable or financial reports it will take place. And actually, the only thing that we are here all today is not only the ESG risk, but the data access to these ESG data which is a key barrier to make the right decisions. But even if we have these data, actually to have the right judgment, whether the transition plans for the banks and for the corporates are ambitious enough to move forward, as Barney put it, to save the planet, actually, because I think beyond that, we are doing a lot of ESG coloring and greening, which is very fine, but we're going to spend a lot of time with that without looking at the real risk. So if you are settled, I would like to start with our first question for the panel, where I would seek for any preconditions that you are aware of that would be needed for transition plans to related ESG reporting standards to improve over time, and also how can regulation pave the way effectively and efficiently. So Irene, I would first turn to you. What is your insight and opinion on the corporate ESG reporting and the included corporate plans in Hungary for the transition? You see a lot of companies looking for net zero, and I think WBCS is very active on this part, also supporting regulation. So how credible are these plans?
So thank you so much for your question. It's nice to be here with you and talk about this really important questions. So the Business Council for Sustainable Development is somehow a community of 130 forward-looking CEOs of different companies from different sectors. And our mother organization is the World Business Council, who is extremely active and very much forerunning in case of ESG, and try to support and promote the collaboration on defining the international standards for ESGs. Because as we learned that this is the most important urgent question to be defined and agreed. Otherwise, ESG reporting will become more shaky, tricky, and dangerous for those companies who are willing to report at first hand. If the ESG KPIs are not standardized, then we try to compare apple with pear, and it will not help, but it will even stop companies doing so. So in Hungary, we led a survey among our member companies, and we learned that most of the companies have already understood that ESGs are not only risk for their business, but rather an opportunity if they report on a transparent way on their performance on social and environmental impact performance as well. And interestingly, the financial insurance sector are the forerunners, of course, the consulting companies, but also the manufacturers are among the first ones who are willing to report and enter into the ESG discussion. You might ask me that who are a bit behind, and as we learned that the very important building construction sector is a bit lagging behind. But we could also observe during the last 1.5 years increasing number of ESG audits and increasing number of different type of sustainability reports. And also the quality of these reports are improving very fast. What is really interesting that very often the first-time reporters companies issue a really high quality reports and they do comply with one of the international standards, and very often those are also audited and certified by a third party service provider as well. So that's, I think, a really great development. So I could observe companies reporting on the SD performance from 2005. So what I can see that during the last 1 year, there is an exponential increase.
Thank you, Irene. I think these are very, very valuable insights on this really tremendous amount of CEOs, 130 that you have already there. It could be very hard to coordinate them and look at who is doing what, but I assume they are responsible for a big amount of GDP of Hungary. So anyone who is moving forward is doing the right thing and with big effort. Yuri, I will turn to you here, and if you can bring us a bit closer how as a bank you see what is at the heart of your ESG, what is your strategy there, and how this is helping the transition, then I think it would be great to hear about your ESG strategy. And if you can also touch upon a bit on which sectors are difficult to finance because you don't have ESG data or you have a lacking regulatory environment, then feel free to comment on that one as well.
Okay, thank you very much. So my first thought or advice for all companies is to have an ESG strategy like we have. And because this is this will greatly help them to make the transition to sustainable operate. And we did the same this summer when we introduced our ESG strategy. And the reason why we did this because our vision is to be a key player in the creation of sustainable banking in the domestic financial market. And if you don't mind, I would like to introduce very shortly what are the main pillars of our strategy, which will help first of all our transition and indirectly our clients' transition. So the first pillar is that we would like to handle the sustainability as a business opportunity and not just as a compliance issue. This means to us that we would like to come out with a lot of green products and services and increase the green asset ratio in our portfolio, and not only to issue reports to the various authorities. The second one is that we are taking ESG risk into account in risk management decisions. And this means that we already started to establish an ESG-based risk framework in which our aim is to identify risks from climate change and environmental damage and to integrate sustainability and climate goals into our risk management practices. Until next summer, we will no longer have any lending transactions where we do not collect ESG-related data and assess our transactions according to the EU taxonomy requirements. The third pillar is that we would like to become a carbon neutral bank. And from January, we will start our so-called net zero banking project, in which we will calculate the whole scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and create a program how bank holding can reduce our carbon footprint. The fourth one is that we would like to be responsible corporate governance, transformation, transparency. The sustainability will be represented on a high level within the bank holding. And we already created an ESG department which will coordinate and monitor all the efforts what the bank holding has. And the fifth one is that the employee well-being, a change in approach, also put a great emphasis on awareness raising, training, and philanthropy based on past success stories as and finally, answering your last question, which question was that which is the most difficult to finance with the current maturity of ESG data? For me, the answer is simple. The small and medium enterprises category or companies is the hardest one because they don't have or they have the less data that we need for the risk assessment. So very shortly, this is what I want to say.
Yes, thank you, Yuri. I think by that we also come to our second question, which is more about how ESG risks are currently available in Hungary today to financing, whether they are already reported or what are the main challenges in reporting this type of risks and what are the obstacles in the process. Yuri, do you want to give some of your perspectives in the last 2 years? How did you see this field emerging, ESG risk coming into the picture with the banks? How does it play a role in the lending process already?
Well, what I see is that unfortunately we are still at the very beginning of this journey. In Hungary, we talk about these issues only in the last 1 or 2 years, in my opinion. And many large companies have prepared and produced sustainability reports in recent years, but few of these have been just a few of them have been structured, which means for me that is not based on an international standard. The most common one is the GRI, which we are using for 2021, and we probably continue to use in the future, but almost large companies can afford it. My view is that the challenge is not how and what individual large companies will report, because that will spread quickly, will be mandatory, some regulation topics, but rather when smaller companies will get to the point where they can produce some kind of simpler report every year and have it audited, and of course mandatory. At the moment, there is a large database that we can work from, which covers the S and the G data reasonably well, but we see serious gaps for letter E. We are, of course, trying to compensate for these with individual data requests, but as there are few meaningful incentives in the market, companies do not feel motivated to provide the data. And the separate problem is that there are a lot of data they don't even know they do not have. So we are working again. And one more thing what I wanted to mention, that the bank holding, as I already mentioned, developed its own ESG risk assessment methodology based on the expectations of the EU taxonomy and the Hungarian National Bank Green Capital Requirement Program, which I think is a big step, but this will require ongoing data provision, where sooner or later we will need databases where we have basic data such as electricity or similar utility consumption, and much more that is already available from various authorities or service providers, just access is not yet provided.
Many thanks for these insights. I turn now to Zoltán, to you, and I will just come in with a simple question concerning this topic. What is your view on these ESG-related risks, environmental risks connected to climate, biodiversity? Are these right now underestimated in economic scenarios, as we are living now in a time where energy is becoming a quite strange commodity to follow, but it's also giving an impetus for reducing emissions, of course. But how do you see currently this field of ESG risk from this economic analytical point of view?
Okay, so first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation to this conference, and I'm very honored to have the opportunity to participate at this panel. As far as your question is concerned, at Raiffeisen Bank, we do follow and we have developed our own ESG scoring system. And to put Hungary into the European context, unfortunately, the Hungarian score is very poor if we take the social or the governance part. As far as the environmental part is concerned, the Hungarian score is mediocre. This may sound not very well, not very good, disencouraging even, but we see it differently because as far as the environmental part of the ESG is concerned, it's much more difficult to initiate changes. But as far as the social and governance part of the ESG is concerned, it's a question of policies. Policy decisions to go forward, to develop. So I think overall the opportunities for Hungary to improve its ESG scores are very good. This is very typical for all Central and Eastern European countries, and it's even more pronounced in the case of Hungary. It's in the same time, obviously, a risk that for our current ESG processes are concerned, these low scores are not very supporting. In the same time, if you take the sovereign issuances, we see that the Hungarian state was a forerunner in ESG bond issuances, especially in the year 2022, but already 2021. So a relatively large share of the Central and Eastern European ESG issuances were done by the Hungarian state. So basically, I finish here, and I'm awaiting the next rounds of questions.
Thank you very much, Zoli. It's very interesting to see actually how you look at internal banking data, as well as how the sovereign green bond issuances have been providing a lot more room for development, and also in terms of data, they were more validated to be on the market, and that can be seen, as I understand, also from the investors' point of view, how they signed up for those, and many of the sovereign funds have international investors, while we could look at some of the corporate or FSI bonds that we have in ESG domain, which might not have been subscribed as much as the sovereign offering. When we look at the databases, Barney, can I come back to you with a question on the ESG databases, how they function? Your firm is using a tremendous amount of data and is also developing them to be even more enhanced. What is your view on the European market of how this data is right now collected, structured, and what's the future to come? Please unmute your mic.
Thank you, Ákos. So many questions in just one question. So, so I think, look, understanding and agreeing with everything that was just said, I think it's very important that despite the challenges, we are going to see a data acceleration, so a data overload much rather than a data scarcity. So there is going to be a shift. I mean, normally, or sort of generally across the board, when it comes to ESG data, it has to be considered that it's publicly available CSR reports and used, and that are used for basically creating ESG databases. And CSR reports have two characteristics. One is that they are in PDF. Two, that they try to, present the unpleasant things even as a pleasant scenario. So you have to work quite a lot to decipher these CSR reports. So it's quite human intensive. So the future, if we say that there is going to be a data overload, much rather than a data scarcity, the data industry and databases will have to provide scale in order to onboard these data sets and put them either as raw data or normalized data or analytics integrated with other financial data sets in front of the financial market decision makers. And this is not an easy task. So one end is, of course, everybody, all big data providers and everybody who has a vested interest in these start to collect data sets, try to scale them in-house, have limited partnerships in different data associations, and go from there. I mean, London Stock Exchange, I think I can say that we are in a leading position when it comes to providing digital toolkits to onboarding these data sets, and we have been strongly working on to actually enhance that capability, where we provide flexibility and mapping to different regulations when we solve challenges around data ownership, etc., etc. The other sort of angle is some sort of centralized data set, data warehouse. And if you think about the European single access point, that is basically that kind of I wouldn't say, so that's the aspirational end goal, to have a sort of a structured database that is that everybody contributes their sort of raw data into, not the CSR report. So it's immediately carrying or ticking one challenge off from the current situation, and makes it available to all financial market participants, either for close to free or for some sort of charge. I mean, that would be a very welcome development, I believe. Because it would make the data, the ESG data, more commoditized, i.e., much more prolific, much more standardized, much more in depth, much more in length, and it wouldn't stop financial market participants to actually build their own analytics on top of them. However, that's 5-6 years away. I think the initial reporting to that is January 2026, and it also requires ESRS to go live before that, so that there is some exact regimes. Not necessarily related to your database question, but I think it's actually a lessons learned from the fund industry, where following the SFDR regulation, basically the European ESG template was created by fund managers, where they looked at, all right, okay, we have to report on MiFID II, we have to report on IDD, we have to report on SFDR, we have to report on EU taxonomy, so nobody knows what to report on really and what metrics to report on. So basically what they have done in a voluntary but sort of really widespread basis, created this template which includes more than 600 metrics from these different regulations, and the fund management industry is going to report through that, or in that kind of template format. Not into a centralized database just yet, but the first step, having a commonly used template, is going to be a very important step for every market participant to pick up the data and solve those challenges that you and I just described.
Yeah, perfectly complex picture of overwhelming discussions on overwhelming standards and templates as well before arriving to a decision. Thank you, Barney, on that. And let me come to my last question in this panel. First to Zoltán, to you. If we would look at some sectors which have this duty on providing actually the ESG data on a more frequent and precise basis on different investments, could you tell which sectors have a more challenging issue by evaluating them based on sustainability standards? And what are the sectors where evaluation for sustainability is easier?
Thanks for the question. I can speak about our experience with our client base and with our research team's experience with the European-wide sectors and specifically Hungarian. So I think that as Rita has mentioned, in case of industrials, the willingness to provide data is relatively high. So I wouldn't agree with I wouldn't disagree with this opinion. I think in case of the utility sector, the real estate sector, or the agriculture sector, the sourcing data is much more challenging. And just obviously the easiest part is the financial sector. So that's at the other end of the scale.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for that. I would come now to Yuri. Yuri, can you tell us which taxonomies you are using? Because as I know, you finance your clients already. Both you look at your clients from ESG risk point of view, but also the financial products. Before you arrive to some locally sound taxonomies and local data, do you use anything else? How do you deal with this type of difficulty in the more difficult sectors, actually?
Well, when we're talking about financing green or sustainable products or clients, we will align all the transactions to the EU taxonomy requirements, and where the EU taxonomy could not be fully applied, such as agriculture, the CBI taxonomy will form the basis of the assessments. And the reason why I'm talking in the future tense, because we'll come out with within 1 month framework where we use these taxonomies in the future. Answering the second question, for me, or my experience is that the agriculture is one of the most difficult areas to deal with, because there are no detailed rules in the taxonomy, EU taxonomy yet. Of course, there are other tools, as I mentioned, the CBI taxonomy, but it's clear that that applying uniform rules is quite difficult. For example, when we are talking about plant production in the agronomy, because this requires completely different tools in the south or the north side of the world. Unfortunately, I'm not yet an expert in agronomy, so I'm just scratching my head and watching developments that will come out. And my opinion is let's say the bright side of the ESG finance is the real estate. It's my opinion, because when we are assessing sustainability risk in the real estate sector, for us is the easiest way, because there are quite precise values and expectations that are set, which either someone meets or not. Fortunately, we have been able to say for years whether a property is green or not, and we have the tools to do so, so we just need to apply them. Unfortunately, there's a price to pay for this, because a sustainable property can be considerably more expensive, so we'll have to pay in the future. So that's all.
Thank you for that, Yuri. I was going to ask Irene as last to pick a sector or pick actually from the experience of your 130 CEOs who are struggling with sustainability right now, and how the membership of WBCSD can help them to move forward.
1.5 years ago, we have started an ESG working group with the purpose to support our CEOs to get knowledge and to get knowledge about ESGs, what are the KPIs, and also to get knowledge about the foreseen regulations. And maybe I should share this information with you much earlier, that you know that at the World Business Council, we have started to think about how could we redefine the values of the companies. And actually, and finally, my vision is that sooner or later we will achieve the status when to talk about ESGs, to talk about reporting and everything what we were talking about now today, it will become the normal part of the business. Because it's nothing else that to understand and redefine the value of the company and measure the value of the company, not only in EBITDA and margin and profit, but rather in the entire impact of the company. And then with that, if we do our work well, then we could integrate and we could achieve the integration of all this reliable data information and reporting into the company's life. And then there will be no need for any conference or workshop on this, because it will be part of the normal business. So that's the vision. How the Business Council can help companies. We work on that to support companies on how to start the procedure, how to enter into the ESG audit, which partner to select. For example, on 24th of January, we will have a so-called sustainability matchmaking event with the purpose to support the companies to find the right company who can support them on this road towards the more sustainable business, and not only the reporting phase, but rather on the action phase. So to understand where are the gaps to prepare the strategy action and then measure this. And it's going to be an ongoing circle, resulting the ideal world when ESG is not important anymore because it becomes the part of the company normal procedure. So how we can help with this matchmaking event, for example, with the workshops, with conferences, with showing and providing and measuring the development through the researches, what we are doing, surveys. And recently we led a survey on the net zero ambitions of the companies. And that was amazing to see that only during 1 year, the number of the companies who are already committed to achieve a net zero, either by 2050 or 2040 or even earlier, doubled. So if we can keep this speed, then in a very short period of time, all of our member companies, and I hope that as a next step, all their suppliers and later all their customers will make their own commitment. And if every company will have the commitment, then it's going to be extremely easy because there will be no question about the scope 3. Because if everyone is taking care of his own emissions, then we could solve the problem. I know it's too ideal, maybe it's too fairy tale-like, but I do believe in that we can achieve it together, and if we involve our partners into this ESG audits, reporting, and so on. And the German law, what was just recently launched, has already has its own effect, because as the suppliers of the German companies, Hungarian SMEs are now requested to provide relevant data on ESG.
Sounds like, Irene, you have great solutions when scope 3 would diminish and scope 1, 2 would grow. So that companies are taking more and more effort to inherit their existing emissions. Very, very nice to hear about this progress is actually at the corporate level. Barney, yes, come in, please.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think it's very important what Irene was raising, because what we have to, and you and I know each other quite well, so we try to always go to companies and present sustainability as an opportunity, and the educational part is very important, so that the regulation shouldn't be like, okay, here is an A4 paper without basically any context to the company, provide these 6, 10, 15, however many data items, because then the quality of the data is going to be as good as basically the quality of that form requesting it. So it's essential, I believe, that that also on a macro level or national level in either country, you know, there is actually, advertisement is not the right expression, but sufficient education and public learning going on. What this means for businesses, what this means for households, so that whenever whoever gets these questionnaires and has to comply with the reg, they actually go to it from a good end, not from the bad end.
Thank you, Barney, for those thoughts. And I think we had a very, very interesting panel today. Just to sum it up, we had 3 great keynote speeches. Thank you for that, Rita, Barney, Gwill, to enlighten us on the ESG race, the reporting part, and also how financial authorities are looking at currently the market. We could pretty much agree that a lot of education will be needed, also understanding the words and the risk behind the words that we are using, and the templates we are using on different financial products when we are developing the way forward. So here I would like to thank also the colleagues joining the panel, Irene, Yuri, Zoli, just to be with us. And I hope you enjoyed our discussion today. The session for financing the transition will come back tomorrow at 10 o'clock here on the same channel for you on YouTube, which is called the Financing the Decarbonisation of the Residential Buildings and Public Institutions. So if you like it, if you like that topic of the building and public institutions, please tune in and listen to the very same channel, 10 o'clock tomorrow. By that, thanking for everyone. I wish you a very nice afternoon and enjoy your ESG journey further on.
Thank you, Ákos. Thank you.